response to U.S. restrictions on Chinese news outlets imposed earlier this month, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Wednesday announced its countermeasures requiring journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal to hand in their media credentials within 10 days. What impact will that action have? How has the U.S. responded, and what's next for the China-U.S. media confrontation? In the first part of our discussion, I'm pleased to be joined by Wang Cong, reporter for the Global Times, and Marcus Rubenstein, editor of APAC News. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing. Wang Cong, let me start with you. You are a journalist yourself. What is your overall take on this media feud between China and the United States, and your reaction when you learned China's countermeasures against U.S. media outlets?
Well, you know, as like you said, as a journalist, and I have been based in Washington, D.C. before, and now have been working in Beijing for many years. It is quite sad to see, you know, all this comes down to this, that, you know, it caused quite a disruption for reporters, you know, colleagues to do their job. However, this is, you know, today I've been speaking with, you know, people in Beijing who are close to this matter. This is more than just a media feud, like you said. This is much more bigger, major issue. That now it's basically what China did earlier this morning is that it's sending a signal that it can no longer you know, let all these smear campaigns by the U.S. officials and the media outlets go unanswered, and that it has now started to take a more direct approach to these ideologically driven attacks on China. And that, you know, from the responses I've seen from both in the United States and in China, it's quite different, and it's also quite telling that where we're headed, because in the U.S., the move has been billed as a oppression of free press. However, in China, I'm sure you are aware that many people applauded this move because they have been so frustrated and angry of this constant, you know, bias towards China, especially in light of this coronavirus pandemic. You know, we've seen U.S. President Donald Trump call this Chinese virus. We have seen U.S. publications call China the sick man of China. So many are frustrated in China, and the U.S., if they don't rethink, I think this is going down to somewhere that is quite dangerous.
We'll talk more about that in just a few moments. Mr. Rubenstein, let me come to you now. China has emphasized in rolling out these countermeasures that they are reciprocal in nature. China didn't have to do this. It was provoked by what China saw as an explosion in all but name of Chinese journalists working in the United States. Your take on China's countermeasures here, are they in proportion? Are they appropriate?
Yeah, Zhang Shi, I think they're unfortunate. Nobody really wants to see, you know, tensions of this nature rise between two global powers, and the backdrop of that tension being, you know, a global health crisis. Yes, the United States did take a move against Chinese journalists in Washington and in the United States. And, you know, it was politically motivated. They say they wanted to even the numbers out, but it was politically motivated. And, you know, China is, and I think many people in the West forget about, so don't realize this or don't appreciate this, China is a legitimate major global power. Perhaps economically not quite alongside the United States, but in stature, you know, without rival. You know, China is entitled to protect its interests and to advance its, you know, its policies beyond its shores, just as the United States has for the best part of a century. So, not unexpected, and I think, you know, given the backdrop of media attacks against the Chinese government and the Chinese people, some of them reports, you know, based on facts and analysis, many reports based on personal attacks, and as Wang mentioned earlier, you know, racist headlines such as China is the real sick man of Asia.
Many would agree that this is an unfortunate situation, as you pointed out, Mr. Rubenstein, but what's done is done. We're talking about three major U.S. news outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. They will be impacted. Their reporting capacity in China will be impacted by these countermeasures freshly rolled out by China. What do you think will be the impact for them?
Well, I think for the reporters themselves, it's an unfortunate situation they find themselves caught up in. You know, for the media outlets, well, they will have alternate sources. News agencies are still operating in China. There is a flow of information out, certainly to the Western media. But you know, I think of the American publications, the Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times have led the charge against China in terms of negative reporting. Excuse me. Just something caught in my throat, not a virus, but.
Good to know. Wang Tong, let me bring you in here. You mentioned how this is bigger than just a feud in the sphere of media, and as the Foreign Ministry of China pointed out, that this is driven by ideological bias, and this is driven by the Cold War mentality. Your take on the impact here, not just on these three U.S. media outlets, but on the larger relations between the two sides?
Yes, that's where, you know, the impact of this, why this thing is so significant. Because as we have, you know, you and me have covered over the last, you know, 2-3 years, there have been quite some tension between China and U.S. However, that has been limited to trade and economic disputes, and there have been progress made in terms of easing tensions. However, what this shows is a more ideological conflict between China and U.S. And you know, the two different governments and the two different publics have a very, very different view on the role of media and you know, the understanding of each other. For example, in the U.S., they're saying that they're basically reporting objective stories about China and informing the American public. However, that's not what people in China see. In China, people see that there are quite a part, you know, as you know, some mentioned, a part of the U.S. overall strategy towards China that is pushing the narrative that China is this evil country when it comes to, you know, whether it's human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, you name it. So many people in China view that they are not independent news organizations. They are actually a part of the overall strategy of the U.S. Government. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but people in China, many who I've spoken with, believe that. So that is where the danger is. The difference of the people of the two governments on these issues is fundamental, and it goes way deeper than just trade, because with trade we can discuss it. These kind of things is more hard, you know, it's harder to resolve. And as we've seen today, China is taking a more direct approach to this. It has been reserved in, you know, in dealing with these ideological conflicts. However, today and over the past few days, we have seen a more direct approach. But I want to, lastly, I want to mention that this has been started all by the U.S. We have seen that U.S. officials, top officials like Mike Pompeo, everywhere he goes around the world, he's painting China as this evil country that is taking over the, you know, the world, and that overall China has been protesting, but really hasn't really taken any more concrete approach to counter that. But recently, or particularly this move we seen earlier this morning, is a direct answer to that, I think, and we will see much more to come if the U.S. does not change that.
With both of you mentioning that Wall Street article titled "China is the Real Segment of Asia," I want to press on a little bit with that as well. That was the trigger some would say, of this media feud between the two sides. The Wall Street Journal refused to apologize. China called it racist and discriminatory. Mr. Rubenstein, how does that article relate to what we're seeing now exploding between the two sides? And if it comes down to different understanding of articles, of op-eds in news publications, will that somehow hold back of any efforts to resolve these confrontations in the sphere of media and to move forward?
I think that article was certainly a trigger point. Now, there's arguments in the West that it wasn't overtly racist, that the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe. Britain, as late as the early 1970s, was called the sick man of Europe. But at the very best, this is language which is half a century old. So, it's a highly offensive title of a story. It offended many, many Chinese people. And it's racially charged in a way that the Wall Street Journal would not direct such comments at its own people in America. So I think that the line in the sand was almost drawn there, and ironically, and perhaps more prudent to say tragically, the thesis of Walter Russell Mead, the academic who wrote the article, was essentially that China had met its match in this coronavirus, and it was incapable, due to its political system, of bringing this under control. Now, tragically, I say, for we outside of China, Professor Mead was completely wrong. China has brought it under control, and now we in the West are struggling. We here in Australia have seen infection rates of COVID-19 double in the last 3 days, and we are on a massive trajectory in terms of explosion of COVID-19 cases, and we, as many other countries in a similar position, simply did not do the things that China did and that other Asian countries such as Singapore or South Korea have done. We in the West have criticised China and kicked China while it was down, and particularly many Western media outlets, to our peril. We've ignored the incredibly vital lesson that China has shown the world, and that is how to deal with this crisis. I'll just finish on this point. Many people in the West, Australia's Chief Medical Officer has said, we risk up to 60% of Australia's population being infected. Less than 0.1% of the Chinese population was infected with the coronavirus. Now, if there's not a lesson for the rest of the world on how to manage a pandemic, despite your politics, your government, your media, whatever, then there's no lesson to be learned.
All right, gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I'll leave you there. Once again, Marcus Rubenstein, thank you so much for joining us today. And this is Dialogue on CGTN. We'll be right back after a short break. In the second part of our discussion on Dialogue today, we'll take a look at the impact of coronavirus pandemic on the sports industry. Rising fears from the coronavirus pandemic have brought most of the world's sporting events to a standstill, but the Tokyo Olympic Games remain on track to open in late July. On Tuesday, the International Olympic Committee reiterated its commitment, saying there is no need to cancel at this stage. To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined by Victor Matheson, Professor of Economics at the College of the Holy Cross, and Grace Lee, CGTN correspondent in Tokyo. Welcome to the program to both of you. Grace, let me start with you. I want to get your take on the general sentiment there in Japan, because for us outsiders looking in, Japanese Olympic officials have been very steadfast on holding the games according to schedule. But a Kyoto News survey says about 70% of the Japanese people think that the games probably should not proceed given the circumstances. Is there a divide between the official line here and what the Japanese people might feel about the Olympic Games?
Yeah, well, I think for a lot of Japanese people who are here, they know what the impact on the economy will be if the games are canceled. It'll be about, it'll take out about 1.4% of the total GDP of the country, and people are going to lose jobs. The economy is going to suffer. They understand that, and I think at this point, though, they're seeing what's happening around the world with the viral outbreak, and they think that, well, you know, it just doesn't seem feasible at this point. We're seeing athletes unable to practice, let alone go to qualifying matches. Many of those have been canceled, and a lot of those qualifying matches, the deadline is the end of this month. Only about 50% of the slots have been filled for Olympic athletes at this point. So it's really hard to see a future where in the next couple of weeks we'll see those slots fill up and people going back to practicing and going back to, you know, going out to these qualifying matches and being able to, you know, move ahead as if everything is normal. And that's precisely what the IOC is demanding from athletes. And we're seeing a lot of pushback from athletes as well who say, well, you're putting our safety in danger, and it seems that the lack of a contingency plan here from the IOC is the real concern.
Professor Matheson, let me come to you now. After that G7 leaders video conference on Monday, Prime Minister of Japan Shinzo Abe announced he had secured support from other G7 leaders in holding the Games in its complete form. But there is a difference between other world leaders pledging their support in a video conference than individual countries actually green-lighting their athletes and their delegates to go to the Olympic Games. In terms of that international support level, international consensus, where do you think we are at this point, about 4 months ahead of the scheduled opening of the Games?
Well, it's very hard to believe that we're actually going to be able to pull this off in 4 months. Again, as our Japanese correspondent said, for sure there's an issue about what athletes are actually going to come. There's a huge case about what countries are going to be open, what countries are going to be having very significant COVID-19 problems of their own by the time they have to send athletes. There's probably not a worse event that you can think of than bringing 10,000 athletes and 10,000 support staff all from all around the world, every country in the world, putting them all in one place in close quarters for 3 weeks during the midst of a pandemic. So while I agree with the G7 leaders and the head of the IOC saying hosting the Olympics would be a great symbol that we have overcome the coronavirus crisis, it's hard to believe that by late July that's going to be something that's feasible.
Grace mentioned one of the problems is that the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, simply doesn't have a contingency plan. So basically, we're all keeping our fingers crossed that things will be brought under control in next summer to allow for the opening of the Games as it is scheduled. Professor Matheson, what more should the IOC do, in your opinion, at this stage?
Well, I think they really have had their head in the sand for a while. As recently as 3 weeks ago, Thomas Bach said, after coming out of an IOC meeting, that we haven't even discussed postponing or canceling the Games. That was either a lie or that was the worst corporate management ever. Of course, everyone in the world 3 weeks ago who was in the tourism and hospitality business was thinking about cancellations and postponements of major events. The fact that Thomas Bach could come out on international television and say they're not even considering such a thing and they have no plans to move or postpone I think we can be rightly critical of him. Of course, the problem is this is an extremely difficult event to postpone, an extremely difficult event to move. This is not a 3-week conference for teachers or for economists that you come together and any hotel can host this on any weekend anywhere in the world at a very easy change. This is an extraordinarily complex Games that involves huge numbers of moving parts. So you can understand why they're very reluctant to make any changes, but you know that may not be up to them.
An unprecedented crisis that the IOC might not have too much experience with. Grace, the simple fact here is that there is no perfect solution. The handful of solutions on the table each come with their own set of problems. Obviously, there have been debates and discussions within the Tokyo Olympic Organizing Committee itself. We heard from one official who said that a postponement of 1 or 2 years is a feasible solution, and then the chief coming out and say that is an outrageous suggestion. Everything should go as planned. Explain to us what the process has been like for the Japanese side, for the Japanese Olympic Committee, in determining which one of these options is more likely, is more feasible at a point like this.
Well, it seems like, at least on the Japanese side and probably on the IOC side as well, they're just scrambling because, like you said, there is no easy answer. There is no easy way out of this. In the past 2 weeks, we've heard everything from let's postpone it to the end of this year, let's postpone it to next year, let's cancel it all together, and everything in between. And of course, every single time a Japanese Olympic official came out and said those things, the IOC would hastily come out right afterwards saying, no, 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 that's not something we're considering at all. We're pushing ahead with the games. And you can only imagine that's not a good sign for investors for the Olympics. That's not a good sign for major players like the NBC or NBC in the U.S., which holds the rights to the Olympics, and they've sunk a lot of money into this, billions of dollars, and they also have to come up with a contingency plan as well if it's pushed back. And a lot of course, major corporations here in Japan who will have to figure out what their next steps are as well. So it just doesn't seem like they know what the right answer is, and they really are struggling. One of the main issues is that, the Olympics is a marriage of a lot of different sports, and each one of those sports have, a host of federations that govern over them, and it's really hard for them, to all sit together and say, hey, here's a 3-week window before 2022 that we can host these games and have the TV space for it and have all our athletes free to come over. It's just not something that will be feasible perfectly, so some sacrifices will have to be made.
Professor Matheson, let's briefly walk through the options on the table here. Hold the games starting July 24th as scheduled, a postponement, a cancellation, and maybe hold the games but behind closed doors. Do you have a theory or a prediction of which one of these options is more likely, more feasible given the circumstances and the projections of where the coronavirus epidemic is headed?
So I can't answer to whether actually playing the games as scheduled is feasible or not. I'm not that sort of doctor. That being said, of the big options on the table, should we not be able to play the games, the moving it just a couple months later in the year is probably not going to happen for 2 reasons. Number one, if the coronavirus is so bad in July that we can't host the games, it's hard to believe that things will be completely safe by September or October. The other thing is the world TV networks already don't want to hold the Olympics in September, October, or November because it interferes with American football in the United States as well as the World Series of Baseball in the United States. It also interferes with college football, all the college sports in the U.S., plus all of the major European soccer leagues. So it's unlikely that we're going to just move it by a couple months. Hosting the event behind closed doors is an option, but what we saw, for example, in the NBA is you can't necessarily do that because the athletes themselves are at risk. We finally canceled the first major wave of sporting events in the United States, specifically because athletes in the NBA actually themselves got sick. There is no way you can protect the athletes themselves.
I see.
And that's why we had this huge rash of cancellations rather than literally no one in the United States is playing behind closed doors now. So I can't imagine the Olympics being the same way. The thing I'm most hopeful about would be a 1-year postponement, exactly the same television window, but 1 year later. Hopefully by that time we have countermeasures for COVID-19 available worldwide. That would be a great coming out for the world. and it fits in the TV schedules. Again, as Grace says, this is horrifically complex for all of the member nations and member organizations of the IOC, but probably better than an outright cancellation. And of course, the reason the IOC is terrified of this is they have an event that only occurs every 4 years. This is not the NBA, where if we lose part of the season, we just restart in September. This is literally the only thing the IOC makes money on for 4 years. Canceling outright is not canceling 1 year of their season. It's essentially canceling 4 years of their season. So I would think postponement by a year.
Professor, another question in your department. Other than the scenario that the games are held as scheduled starting July 24th, all of the other scenarios will come with economic disruptions and economic consequences. Grace touched on this a little bit earlier. This is a complex system involving everyone from organizers, sponsors, advertisers, to people who bought a ticket to the games. What kind of economic disruptions and impact will we be seeing?
So if you host it behind closed doors, what you lose is your ticket sales, as well as all of the hotel revenue, for example, for all the tourists coming in. The ticket sales would be about $1 billion of loss for the IOC, and you're talking maybe $500 million of hotel sales and other things as well. So closed doors is a really, really attractive option for the IOC if you can get it done. And again, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm an economics doctor, so I can't answer whether that's going to happen. But what we did see is, again, the NBA had a huge reason to do the same thing, just cancel the in-person tickets while still maintaining the television, and they weren't able to do that, nor was the NHL or the NCAA basketball in the United States. So I don't think that's likely, but that would be a fairly low loss on the part of both the IOC and the Japanese economy. If you're able to move it for a year, it causes massive headaches and disruption for a year, but at least you get all the revenue at some point. So you get all the revenue you were going to get. It's just delayed a year. Cancellation outright, however, is a huge problem. First of all, Japan has already put in maybe $25 billion into preparing for the games, and the actual hosting of the games stands to make them somewhere in the vicinity of $5 to $10 billion from sponsorships, from tickets, and from TV rights. That's something certainly the IOC doesn't want to lose.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have on this broadcast. Grace, Professor Matheson, thank you so much for your input and for your time. I think it's fair to say a lot of people still want the games to go ahead. We could all use a lift up in spirits with what's going on with the coronavirus pandemic. And that is the end of Dialogue Today. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing. Thank you so much for your company.